Alrighty, here we go. Recording some video for Art 148 Quiz 2 review. This review is mostly about flash photography, manual flash exposure, the elements that go into that. So if you can remember that stuff, that's what you need for the quiz. As all the quizzes here, they will be 10 questions, multiple choice. And there will be one bonus fill in the blank question as an extra credit. No notes, no phones, no laptops, just what's in your brain for data to use for completing the quiz. If you have any questions about the content, please let me know. All right, let's get started. Here we go. Flash exposure equation. We need to talk about that. What's the elements of it, how it works, and how it adds on to the ambient light exposure equation. So the flash exposure equation is very similar in some ways to the ambient light exposure equation. It's got some differences, but it starts at the same place with shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And then it adds two more elements. The elements it adds are the power of the flash, so the amount of energy that the flash puts out, as well as then the distance of the flash to the subject. So you've got a total of 5 variables you need to manage that'll determine how bright the photo is with your flash exposure. So let's start with shutter speed. So in a flash exposure, shutter speed controls the amount of the existing light, the light that's in whatever space you're in, whether you're outside or inside. If whatever light is in there, you control the volume of that, the brightness of it, with shutter speed. So a slower shutter speed, longer duration, will let more of that existing light in. Okay, so a longer exposure shutter speed will let more of the ambient, the existing light, into your flash exposure. All right, and one thing to be aware of with this, that when your shutter speeds get slower and there's motion, you'll get this effect called dragging the shutter, usually below 1/60th of a second. And what happens is any camera motion or motion in the subject will make light streaks, will make blurs. It's kind of a neat effect. It can be used creatively to blend, again, ambient light with the exposure from the flash. So here's an example. At the end of a wedding, the send-off with some light wands, and they're shaking, the guests are shaking the light wands, and you get the blur. The couple is not moving very much, so they're pretty sharp. You got that kid falling in the back over the groom's shoulder. I never saw that in the first time I took the photo, but anyway, so you got that. Here's another example, flash bouncing off the ceiling, couple's first dance. You got a little bit of blur in the couple. You get some different light bouncing around on them, but it's a kind of a neat effect. It's a little different, but that's where you blend the ambient light with a longer exposure. So you're going to get some motion. Anything that's moving will likely move a little bit in the flash exposure, like here. The glow sticks are moving, and here the couple's moving, and the reflections, especially on her jewelry, are also moving. So one thing we can do, another element we can do with shutter speed, just like we can blend ambient by letting more of it in with a longer duration, we can also completely get rid of the ambient light by having a short duration shutter speed to get rid of that ambient light. So the ambient light in your room will not be, or your outdoor or wherever, if you have the right combination of shutter speed and flash power settings, you will not have any of that light in your flash exposure. All the light in the exposure would come from the flash itself. So let's talk about how shutter speed works in a flash exposure. We'll walk through some examples of going to longer shutter speeds. So we're going to add in more of the ambient light. Let's start here. You can see the settings on the camera, shutter speed at 1/250th of a second, which is the maximum shutter speed on my camera that will synchronize with flash. We'll talk about that in a second. Aperture's f2, so we get the blurry background. The ISO is at 200, and the flash power, which we'll also talk about later, is at 1/64th power, so it's a very low power setting. So what I'm going to do is go to longer duration shutter speed. So this is a short duration. Here we go, longer. So we're going to start letting in more light. You're going to see more glow from the background. The lights are adding more to this. The box camera in this photo will stay the same brightness because it's being exposed by the flash primarily. So there's a half a second and there's 1 second. So all this glow is coming from those Christmas lights that are taped to the background. That's what's making this glow. There wasn't any other light in the room. It was just this. So when you go to 1 second, that's the light you're going to get. Plus, the flash is exposing, making the box camera, have its exposure. So it's kind of a blending. I'll show you in the next photo where I'm going to move the camera. It'll be a half-second exposure, and I'm moving the camera. So the camera has some ghosting because part of it is also lit a little bit by those Christmas lights. So that's the ghost image. But the main part of it is lit by the flash, so it's sharp and not moving. I was moving the camera side to side, so that's why you've got motion that looks side to side. Kind of a fun thing to play with shutter speed. Another element connected to shutter speed with flash photography is called sync speed, synchronization speed. And what that is the fastest shutter speed you can use on your flash and still effectively expose the whole frame of the image. They're usually, depending on your camera, anywhere from 1/160th, 1/200, or 1/250th of a second is the maximum shutter speed you can get to still expose the whole frame correctly. What do I mean by that? Let me show you. So on my older camera, my maximum flash exposure was 1/180th, and you'll see at the bottom of this frame there's a bar of darkness creeping in. And if you go to 500, you can even see it more. So only a little bit of the photo was exposed by the flash because the timing of the flash doesn't match the timing of the shutter movement. It's complicated. I don't know that I understand all the physics of how it exactly works, but just know whatever your sync speed is, that's the fastest, shortest duration shutter speed you can have and still expose the whole scene of your camera frame for the flash. It's also sometimes called X sync speed. If you have a shutter speed on your camera and it's got an X by it, that means that's the synchronization speed. If you're not sure what your synchronization speed is, just look it up. Head online real quick and look, enter your camera name and model number, and then add the phrase sync speed, SYNC speed, and you should be able to get an answer right near the top of the search results. So that's shutter speed as it's connected to flash. There's a motion element to it, but the main element that it's different in regular photography is it's really about controlling how much of the light in this scene already that's not flash, the constant light sources, are going to be included in the flash exposure. Next, we have aperture. Aperture's a little different in how it works with flash. The main element it contributes to is how much of the flash exposure, how much of the light from the flash is, let me change that. What aperture controls is the brightness of the flash in the photo. It's basically like a volume control for the flash power itself. If you have a larger aperture opening, you're going to get more light from the flash in the photo. If you go smaller with the aperture opening, you'll have less light from the flash. So it's a volume control for your flash brightness in the photo. And obviously, or not, maybe not obviously, but aperture still controls what's in focus in the photo, the depth of field, the amount of distance of image of objects in the photo that are in focus. So you'll get to see some examples of that as we change aperture in the next sequence of photos. So here we go. Here's our starting point. The shutter speed will stay constant at 1/250. I will be changing the aperture. We'll kind of start in the middle on this lens at f5.6. ISO is at 200, so that's basically very low. And the flash power in this set of photos is at 1/8. And so of the four variables here, the only one I'm going to change is aperture. So we'll start at 5.6. And what you'll see is we're going to go to a smaller opening, which is a bigger number, and the camera will get darker. The light on the camera, the box camera here, will get darker. So there's f8.0, which is the next stop, the next click. The background still is about the same brightness, but notice those little light bulbs are getting smaller because they're passing through a smaller opening. They'll also start to get a little sharper. Let's go to f11. The camera is darker. Background balls of light are a little smaller. Here's f16, very dark on the flash. I mean on the camera, excuse me. So that's the smallest opening on this lens. Let's go the other direction. We started at 5.6, so now we're going to go brighter with a larger opening of f4.0. Here's what that looks like. f4.0, the box camera is brighter. The lights in the background are about the same brightness. You're getting more brightness on the background now because the flash is hitting that a little bit. And the balls of the light are getting larger and softer on those Christmas lights in the background. So here's the next at 2.8. Very bright on the box camera, background brightening up a little bit with the flash hitting it a bit, and the Christmas lights are getting a little softer and more round. And here we go at f2.0, softest lights in the background, lots of light on the flash. On the box camera again, because I did not change the flash power. It stayed consistent throughout, but it got brighter because I was making the aperture, the volume control of the flash, smaller or larger from where we started. So there's that. So oftentimes when you approach a flash exposure, you've got two ways to go. You can control the brightness through aperture, or you can control it through the flash power, depending on what you want to do. For example, I like the way this background looks. I like the darker, the bigger, blurrier Christmas lights. So I want to keep my aperture here. I'm going to keep my shutter speed the same and my ISO. So what I'm going to do is I want to go back to the darker background and correct exposure on the camera. So I'm going to reduce my flash power. And that's what happens here. So the flash power is all the way down at 164, so it's not working very hard to make the flash. The box camera has a nice amount of light on it, and that background is nice, blurry blobs of Christmas lights back there. All right, so that's aperture, the volume control of how much a light from the flash is in the photo. All right, let's go to ISO. And ISO behaves pretty similarly to how it behaves in a regular exposure. It basically controls the brightness of everything. So amplifies both the light from the flash and whatever existing or ambient light there is. So, just like with in a regular exposure, you need to be aware of the characteristics of your camera and how it behaves as you turn the ISO up. What level of ISO becomes noisy and irritating and bothersome for you. So every camera will do differently there, as well as your personal taste for ISO noise. So let's get started with a sequence of photos. In this sequence of the four variables here, we're going to just change ISO, as you can see. So we'll start with an ISO at the bottom of the scale on this camera, the lowest ISO, which is 200. Then we'll go up, we'll double it each time until we get to the end. So everything in the image will get brighter, both the box camera and all the other elements in the photo. So we'll start at 200. Here's 400, 800, 1600. Everything's getting very, very bright. 3200. Now we're starting to see some noise, especially in the background on things that were black. And here's 6400. We got one more to go, so we'll go there too. 12,800. So a little too bright. But this is good to be aware of. Most of the time, I leave my ISO as low as I can go. The only reason I might turn my ISO up is if I'm finding to get the exposure I want, I'm having to turn my flash power to a higher level. So I might, to conserve battery, turn my ISO up from 200 to 400 or maybe 800. All right, so that's ISO. It's the amplifier of all the light in the photo, both flash and ambient. Then we get to flash power, the fourth variable here. And flash power is designated in fractions of full power. So full power is 1/1, and then you reduce from there by half for each click, each stop. So you start at 1/1, and then you would go 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 16th, 32nd, 64th, 1/128. Some flash units will stop at 164. Some will continue on to 1/256. So either way, that's your approximate range. You have quite a bit of range, anywhere from 6 to 8 clicks or so of power that you can play with your flash. When you get to the 1/1, it's a big pop of light, so it's going to reduce how many flashes you're able to get out of the unit itself because you're using batteries, as well as it will increase the time between when you can take the next flash photo, the cycle time, the recycle time. So usually I try and take photos at 1/2 to 1/4 power. 1/8 to 1/4 power, or 1/16. That's a nice sweet spot for a nice amount of power, good flexibility in the exposure, and it quickly recycles and it doesn't use batteries very quickly. So let's walk through a sequence of photos where we're going to vary the power from the flash. So we'll start at 1/8 power from the flash with a nice exposure on the box camera, and the background's pretty dark. And what we're going to do initially is we'll start by making the flash brighter. So we'll go from 1/8 power. We'll have twice as much power, which takes us to 1/4. So the box camera is getting brighter, and some of the background is too, just because of the spill of the light. Then we'll go to the next half, twice as much power, which is half. And here's full power on that flash. So the box camera is getting brighter. The exposure is too much on that. So we started at 1/8, and then we went all the way to full power. Let's go the other direction to minimum power. And so we'll go from 1/8. If you go to half as much power, that's 1/16. So the box camera is getting darker. And then you go to 1/32nd, 1/64th, and 1/28th. So not much light on the of anything in here on the box camera. So yeah, not much power from the flash, so you don't get much light on your subject. So you're not going to see a sequence of photos for the next variable, which is flash distance to subject. This is governed by the inverse square law, which is an equation that will let you know how your flash power changes as you change the distance of the flash to your subject. So if you move it closer or farther, you'll know approximately how much brighter or darker that should be. Then you can adjust the rest of the exposure to compensate. Here's how inverse square law works. Basically what it's saying is you're going to lose the most power when you double the distance the first time. So anytime you double the distance, you lose 75% of your light power, which can be significant, but just be aware of that. So how do you decide how to make a flash exposure given these five variables, or what tools do we have for helping us to do that? There's two basic ways. The first is called TTL, and that stands for through the lens. And that means the camera and the flash are talking to each other so it can still do an automatic exposure setting for you. The nice thing is that makes it fast. You don't have to do any math. Everything happens quickly as you're changing environments. If you're moving flash or closer or farther, if your subject's closer or farther, or if it's moving in or out of more or less light. The downsides are they tend to be brand specific. So you need a TTL for Canon if that's what you have. You need Sony if you have Sony, and so on. My experience is the TTL can be inconsistent in flash exposure. You may not change any variables, but the next photo you take might have a totally different exposure, might be too bright or too dark. And they do tend to be more expensive, although lately there have been some brands coming out, and the ones we use here in class, the Godox, are not very expensive at all. They're under $100, which is relatively inexpensive for flash gear. The next way to determine flash exposure is to go with a manual method where you're going to set all five of the exposure elements and determine what your exposure will be. So you're going to set all those things yourself. And then the advantage to this is it doesn't cost any extra money. You'll get consistent exposure as long as you keep the variables consistent. So even though you're moving around, the flash will always be the same power to your subject, and everything will look, theoretically at least, the same exposure. No surprises. The downside is you got to do a little math. Usually that means multiplying by 2 or dividing by 2, knowing a little bit about how square roots work if you're moving the flash from or farther or closer to your subject. And the downside also to this is you're less able to be quick moving, because if you move, especially if you move yourself and then you need to move the light, you got to recalculate the exposure. So it's less spontaneous, but it is more control. So it's trade-offs, like most of life. And then next, how do we've been talking so far about using flash when it's not on the camera, because that lets us place it where we want the light. It gives us usually a more pleasing light. So how do we make flash what's not on the camera? How do we make it flash when we want it to? There's 3 basic ways. We can use what's called a synchronization cable. It's a wire that attaches from your camera to the flash. They work well. They're relatively inexpensive, just usually $10 to $20. Downside is, for me at least, I'm clumsy and tend to trip on things. You are limited in distance. You do need to think about where they're going and what's in the way. So it restricts movement a little bit. You get lots of, you have some economic benefits, but there's some practical downsides that I think that can get in the way pretty quickly. Yeah. So another way to trigger flash when it's not on your camera is with infrared. So you're using light that is a trigger on your camera that will, when you click your camera button, it will send a light pulse to the flash, which will then tell the flash to fire. The advantage to this is, this can be TTL, so it can work through the lens. It can still be automatic exposure. But the downsides are it's line of sight, which means you need to be able to see whatever sensor on your flash is receiving that infrared signal. And if it doesn't work very well outdoors, and it has limited distance, usually 30 or 40 feet, which sounds like a long ways, and often it's more than enough. But compared to the next method, it's not very far. Also, it can be a little inconsistent how it works depending on the room you're in or the space you're in. It may or may not trigger all the time. It also could be a little expensive depending on the system you're using. Our last method for triggering flash is a radio. That's what we're going to use in our class. There are various kinds of these, from relatively inexpensive and very cheap, frankly, and not very consistent, to kind of medium priced to kind of high priced. We'll go with the lower end, but that's one that's really, really good. The one we use is a transmitter that talks to the built-in receiver in our flashes. So it sits on the camera, one piece, and then it talks to the flash, and it can do TTL, so it can be auto exposure, and you can also change the flash settings, which is kind of nice with the one we use. So I can tell the flash to be brighter or darker. I can trigger multiple flash and have some be at different brightness values, which is quite nice flexibility. The system we use is not very expensive as camera things go. It's about, I think, $70 for the radio. Again, that's a system by Godox. So those are the ways we can well, here's some advantages to radio. Quite a long distance. They can go, some of them go a quarter mile or more. Not limited to line of sight. You have more options for placement of the flash relative to the camera. They tend to be more consistent. You get more times when you click the flash that the flash actually fires. Click the camera, excuse me, and the flash actually fires. The radio is probably like 99%. The infrared might be 95%. And a sync cable tends to be 100% unless you tripped on it and disconnected it. Radios can be medium expensive to cheap to, like I said earlier, pretty doggone expensive. So there you go. These are the topics for your review for the quiz, which will be coming up in our next class. If you have questions, please let me know by text or email if you need additional information. Again, the test will be, the quiz, excuse me, will be 10 questions, multiple choice, one fill in the blank extra credit question. So I hope this has been a helpful review. There will be a PDF of this document on our Canvas page. So review that, watch this video 10 or 20 times, and you'll be good to go for the quiz. Hope that helps, and good luck on the quiz.